This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mohsen Kadivar, Department of Religion of the Duke University. It's my honor to introduce Professor Abdullah Ahmed al-Naim, distinguished originally from Sudan, and now he's the professor, distinguished professor of Emory Law School. So we will have his speech, and after that, after his speech, we will have question and answers, and my response will be at the end of the program. Come please.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I have this double, I think, handicap of being after lunch and following two brilliant presentations this morning. And also I was in fact reflecting on the fact that I don't tend to prepare a text beforehand, so I don't have even that excuse to say that I have already written this. So what I try to do is to try to keep it in my mind going until the last minute, and hopefully it will come off. And well, I will see, maybe this will be the first time it doesn't work. The thing is that the title, as you know, Human Rights, Universality and Sovereignty, the Relevance and Irrelevance of Sharia. To begin with, I want just to very much thank Ellen and her colleagues for the honor of participating in this effort to rescue human rights, as it were, actually, from a legalistic political science type of discourse. And I think this morning already I always envy anthropologists for their very, very powerful language and their literary skills. I mean, every anthropologist I read or heard have this flair with language, which is very powerful. But it is more than that. It is about trying to probe the roots of the idea in our consciousness, in our experiences, and our institutions, and its transformative power. And maybe on that, I would end with some remarks about Layla's sort of reservations about the human rights paradigm. So I'm grateful to be part of this enriching and very wise and broad experience of engaging these issues. I'm also grateful to Arzu and Layla for, in a way, teaching me, educating me about different dimensions of the issue, which I hope to try to draw from. But as I said, I'm a lawyer by training, and unlike Urzu, I'm only a lawyer. I mean, she's more than a lawyer, but I'm just a lawyer. And for that, I can't really get out of it so fast anyway. So I think I am a subversive lawyer, yes. I'm a heretic lawyer, yes. But that's not going to be enough. It is more about drawing on sort of understanding and knowledge and experience and feeling about the issues that I hope to try to emulate. The point I was going to pick on, I will get to my pre-prepared talking points, but the point about Layla's remarks, which came in her response even to one of the questions about the hegemony of the human rights discourse, and that there is nothing else, as it were. I mean, that it has displaced, actually, the term that she used, other types of discourses that we need. But my point is, which human rights discourse are we talking about? I mean, that I do not believe that we have lost, or that the human rights discourse have been hijacked or have been. I think that we lose only what we concede. And those of us who wish to challenge certain sort of trends or perspectives in the human rights discourse itself have to keep doing that, because contesting power has to be on the same space that power discourse is exercised. To be effective, we have to challenge that on its own ground, and not to cede or to concede that ground. So it is, for me, it is to say that the human rights discourse is hijacked or is sort of co-opted, which is probably true, but the question is not, that is not the end of the story. I mean, and that it is in the spirit of human rights itself that I challenge the very appropriatory sort of appropriation of the discourse. And in a way, I think the question is on what's new. I mean, that power will always try to hijack whatever discourse that is effective and sort of authoritative to the community. So it is not to concede, but to try. So what I'm saying about, so in reclaiming or, actually I never gave it up to reclaim it, to claiming the human rights discourse is not to underestimate the challenge of appropriation and loss of the credibility and authenticity of the experiences and so on. Now, moving on to my own remarks, and let me see how I can develop them in light of what I heard this morning. So the idea of human rights as an idea, I tend to think of it in three C's, as it were: the concept, the content, and the context. So the concept is the concept of universal rights of the human as human, by virtue of our humanity. And I think very few of us might question that concept as a concept. I think disagreement and challenge will come when we talk about the content and the context. So the idea of human rights is the notion of universal rights for every human as human. What are those rights? And what is the context in which they are articulated? What is the context in which they are affirmed, asserted, contested? And all of that is where the struggle is. It is not on the concept level itself. But on the concept of the level of the concept, I think the idea of universality, for me, is paradoxical. In the sense that how can we have universal rights for the human as human in the reality of permanent difference? In the reality of permanent and profound difference. And that difference itself is really the essence of what human rights are about. And I always, at this point, in trying to make this point, I cite and quote Albie Sachs, the South African constitutional justice, who said that human rights are about the right to be the same and the right to be different. So the right to be different is inherent to the idea of human rights itself, to the idea of universality. So my rights as a human are my rights as who I am. It is not my rights as some fictitious or imaginary or universal human. It is that the idea of universality of rights, does it presuppose or require a universality of the human? And who is the human who is universal? And I think those are dimensions of what I call the paradox of universality. The other paradox, which Arzu, I think, emphasized in the morning also, is the paradox of self-regulation by the state. That the idea that human rights immediately evoke the state in our minds, and that we know that the paradox of sovereignty and the assumption that sovereign states are going to protect us from themselves, that is. So it is what I call the paradox of self-regulation by the state. How can we expect the state to protect human rights against itself? Those are the paradoxes that I see in the so-called dominant human rights discourse, in political science, in legal circles. But it is not the only sense in which I use the term or in which I would claim to appropriate it for myself. At that level of those paradoxes, I say that mediation is the way forward. It is a question of mediation through practice. It is not to deny the paradox, but in fact to acknowledge the paradox and to engage it rather than to pretend it doesn't exist by some sort of hegemonic discourse that displaces difference or sort of normalizes, naturalizes some form of humanity as universal humanity. In approaching this subject at this level, I'm saying that who is the human in human rights? Which we'll see that why I'm raising the point. The human in human rights is a self-determining human. So self-determination is inherent to the possibility of the idea. It is not something that, it's not a human right, although it is, but it is about the nature of whatever human rights are, that it has to be premised and founded on my self-determination. So for me, my rights are my rights as who I am, not as what someone else would like me to be. And I think you can see linkages, I hope, with what Leila was saying, and also Arzu was saying also earlier on. So if that is the case, the notion of imposition of human rights norms is not only counterproductive and unsustainable, it is a total negation of the idea itself. So human rights cannot be imposed in any way, manner, or fashion. Not only that, it is not sustainable because you are never going to be there long enough or permanently enough and present enough to make it happen. It's not going to happen, and you are not going to achieve anything. And I think the example of Afghanistan was cited briefly this morning, which makes the point. But also that it is a negation of the inherent connection between self-determination and human rights. So it is only I who define my human rights, and it's only I who apply and protect my own human rights. Any project that does not make that the core of its sort of mission negates the very idea. It is not just simply rhetorically, but conceptually, fundamentally. But of course, we know that in reality that victims may not necessarily have the right, or the ability rather, to protect to define or to protect their own rights. But the point is that any project that has to engage the idea, or claims to have the idea, must be grounded on this assumption, the assumption that only the human can define her own rights and protect her own rights. That if in any sort of tactical or short-term manner we need to provide institutions, normative resources, and other types of resources to protect people's rights, we should know that that has to be getting to the point where people will have total control over their own rights and what they mean to themselves, and to protect them accordingly. Now, coming to the close almost of my initial introduction, imperialism is alive and kicking. I think that is also a fundamental insight that we have to keep in mind, that it is what I call the imperial impulse is a universal. And also the impulse, the subaltern resistance also is universal. By that I mean, and I think maybe to be clear on the point, it's not only that powers like the United States are imperial, which they are, but that we all have the imperial impulse. So the imperial impulse is not only for the elites, and it's not only for certain developed parts of the world against other parts of the world. It is a universal human phenomenon, the impulse to dominate, the impulse to exploit. So, and I think one of the fallacies of the human rights movement, of which I am part, is that we tend to assume that those who advocate human rights somehow have transcended their human frailties and sort of realities of being. So as if being a human rights advocate, I'm somehow above it. And that because I believe in the right ideas and I asked for those ideas to be lived and experienced, I'm somehow not a source of the violation, not a source of the negation of the idea of human rights, which I think is a fallacy that we should expose to ourselves and to others. And finally, to say that for me, therefore, as I move on to the other aspect of my presentation, is that resistance has to claim the same space where the power discourse is happening, because that's where you need to defend your humanity and your human rights. And for that, I refuse to cede the human rights discourse. And I refuse to accept any understanding of it or practice of it that would seem to be ineffective or counterproductive for my priorities and my concerns. So I'm talking here about the notion of a shared vision of the normativity of human rights as something that we should try to internalize for ourselves, we should try to practice for ourselves, regardless of what others do. That nobody else can do something that will induce me to give up on this. Because to me, it is vitally important. To me, it is very critical to the very core of my humanity, as it were. And I do have a discourse, or rather sort of thinking in terms of how to do that internalization and claiming and refusing to cede the discourse. So internal discourse, what I call internal discourse and cross-cultural dialogue. So to create that all this space which power may claim and may seek to displace my being there is exactly where I need to be, and we can think of ways of doing that. And again, the dialectic of the local and the global, not only to think locally and act globally, but also to act globally and think locally, as it were. In terms of culture, briefly, so that if the discussion should take us that way, I think that it's not only a question of culture and human rights. It's about culture of human rights. And that's what I mean about internalizing the values. So that if I accept the idea of human rights as inherent and essential to my humanity, and I refuse to cede it, I am seeking to internalize it and to practice it for my own reasons in my own space, regardless, as I said. And that's what I mean by the culture of human rights. Now, because I'm sure that at least my discussant may very well be expecting that part of the focus on the question of Sharia or Islam, as in the title of this conference, Islam and Human Rights. Of course, that is also part of the reason why we have to talk about this, that it is to talk about Islam and anything is problematic, of course, because there is no such thing as Islam in the abstract. There is sort of to think of Islam as a concept, as an idea, is not very productive. But the problem is that people do think that way. So we have to address what people think of in those terms. The reason I mention this is to say that also the term Sharia is problematic, because there is no, and I'm sure Chairman Jackson is here, we will engage in this discourse at some point. People prefer to talk about fiqh, not Sharia. That to be more precise, it is about fiqh, which means understanding. Literally, it means understanding. So people would like to say, some people tend to say that Sharia is divine, but fiqh is human. And therefore, by calling it fiqh rather than Sharia, we can engage it and contest it. But my point is that there is no such thing as Sharia except through fiqh. So fiqh is Sharia as far as human beings are concerned. Meaning that as soon as you begin to think of Sharia in any sense, it has become fiqh already. Because it has become human understanding and human experience. So this is, for me, the distinction between fiqh and Sharia is not useful. And the other reason that I keep talking about Sharia is because the vast majority of Muslims do speak about Sharia. So if I speak about fiqh, it seems like I'm talking about something else than what they mean. My point is that whether you call it fiqh or Sharia, it is the same. It is all to do with human understanding and experience. It can never be otherwise. From that, I move on to say that Sharia is not divine. Fiqh is not divine. Whatever it is that human beings can comprehend and experience is not divine. And for me, that's a very empowering idea. To demystify, to deny divinity to anything that human beings can even talk about or think or imagine. I think hopefully the relevance of this point may come as I move on. And the question of the politics of cultural translation is also a very useful title. But to me, I would add transformation and translation, or rather translation. You can take your pick, either translation of transformation and so on. The idea is to inject the notion of change in the process, and also the human subjectivity in the process, so that when you say translation, always, of course, it means that we are injecting a human dimension, and every translation is an interpretation, whether conceptually or literally, meaning whether you are translating a text or translating an idea, it is an interpretation. Because what you understand and try to communicate is your understanding of the idea, not the idea in the abstract. And that is true about the Quran or about Islam or about anything that we deal with at this level. So it is with this caveat that I move on to engage a more specific aspect of the notion of hermeneutics, or the hermeneutical dimension of the project. Because some of my writing has been in terms, and I see assigned to the students in this class, or the class connected to this colloquium, is the notion of Islamic hermeneutics for human rights. And I do this with all the reservations that I have tried to highlight already so far. So the idea is that to the extent that Sharia is relevant to people's consciousness and experience and struggles, whether rightly or wrongly, and whether you call it fiqh or Sharia, and to the extent that there is more to it than Sharia in any case, there is more to it than Islam in any understanding of it. I think very much what Layla was emphasizing in terms of people's sort of the complexity of their lives and the contingency of their lives. With all that granted, there is a dimension of the discourse that we have to engage, which is this sort of elite discourse about Sharia or about fiqh. And at that level, we have to challenge notions or understandings, not that they are sort of dominant or necessarily exclusive of anything else, but to the extent that they are part of the process and part of the situation we are dealing with, in some way or another, we have to engage those aspects. And on that, I think sort of those who read those pieces is to do with the contextuality of the Quran, the contextuality of Muslim experience, and the nature of the state, the nature of Islam and religion, and so on. And that's where I will come to the part of my remarks to do with the relevance and irrelevance of Sharia or fiqh. My idea is to shift the paradigm completely. That not only to demystify Sharia completely and to say that it can never be divine, it's always human. It can never be sort of abstract in sort of ahistorical manner. It's always contextual, historical. And that, talking about the nature of the state, the nature of law, that the state can never be Islamic. Sharia can never be enforced as a state law and remaining Sharia. That is, and hopefully you'll see why I'm getting into this. That the idea is that a principle of Sharia ceases to be Sharia by the very act of enacting it as a state law. It becomes the political will of the state and not the religious law of Islam or Muslims. So my point is to say that whatever the state does is secular. It can never be religious. The state itself can never be religious. It is totally incoherent to say Islam is the religion of the state. And it is totally incoherent to say that Sharia is the law of the state. Through this type of discourse, and I'm happy to revisit these issues and talk about them in our question and answer part, from this I seek to say that Sharia is irrelevant to state law. And therefore, it is irrelevant to what the state can do about human rights. That, I mean, the obvious examples I'm sure that in many people's minds is about how Islamic family law or Islamic criminal law, we heard about it this morning. To me, all of that is secular. It is not Sharia and cannot be Sharia. So in that sense, for the legalistic aspect of our human rights discourse, to the extent that human rights have to do with the state, Sharia is irrelevant. And therefore, if the state is enacting laws that are oppressive of women or religious minorities or criminal justice, In all of that, the state is acting as a secular institution and should be confronted as such. And for me, it is empowering for Muslims to know that there is nothing divine about anything the state can do. There is nothing Islamic about anything the state can do, especially states like Iran and Saudi Arabia, precisely because they make that claim. Other states which make it sort of in a half-hearted way or ambivalent way are, I think, less problematic conceptually, because we know that their insincerity and fallacy of the claim is more obvious. I want to make the claim in absolute terms. There has never been an Islamic state in history. There can never be an Islamic state in human life, future or past. That Sharia has never been enforced by the state. Not only empirically that it didn't happen, but conceptually it is impossible for it to happen. That is why Sharia is irrelevant to human rights on the state side of the issue. So that the state can never claim Islamic exceptionalism, as it were, the term Americans are familiar with. There is no such thing as Islamic exceptionalism, or American exceptionalism, of course. I mean, the only exception about exceptionalism is for those who don't claim it. But anybody who claims to be exceptional is, in fact, the least exceptional, because everybody does it. So the point is that there is no Islamic exceptionalism. Analyze, understand, engage Muslim societies, so-called Muslim majority states, on the same terms, in the same ways that you would engage any state anywhere. So the fact that the majority of the population are Muslims are not a reason to understand the nature of the state differently or the nature of law differently. It is the same phenomenon of a political institution exercising its so-called sovereign authority and power, using law as a tool of its hegemony, in the same way that it happens everywhere else. Of course, I mean, you have to, in every case, you have to understand the way it is happening. But there is nothing exceptional about the fact that it is happening in a so-called Muslim majority society or country. So it is irrelevant. Sharia is irrelevant as far as human rights and the state are concerned. But Sharia remains relevant as far as human rights in terms of cultural, social, and sort of structural aspects of social life and so on. So on the state side is irrelevant. On the non-state side, and that's why I embrace the idea of human rights as beyond what the state can do or fail to do. The reason that we engage the state is in the nature of actually the post-colonial. It is in the nature of international law. It is in the nature of the fact that in the post-colonial we are all organized on Westphalian model of the state, on European ideas of the state and positive law. And therefore, when we try to articulate universal norms, the way we organize the process has to involve states, because those are the units of the international legal system, and therefore that's how they get to convene and how they get to approve treaties and all of that. But none of that constrains or exhausts the possibilities of what human rights can be about. So in fact, when I say that Sharia is irrelevant to human rights on the state side, that may sound shocking and heretical, and I'm fine with that. But actually, it is the less problematic aspect of my position. My position is not the irrelevance of Sharia, which I think it is empowering to know that. But the problem is the relevance of Sharia on the non-state side. How to access that, how to engage that, how to transform that. I think that's where the real work has to happen for those of us who are Muslims and engage sort of in human rights struggles in Muslim societies. So those are what I meant to say on the broader questions, on my own remarks. But let me close. I mean, the advantage of having also not written text is that, unlike Leila and Arzu this morning, I can in fact incorporate what's going on now, because I'm thinking of it and sort of as I'm preparing my remarks to the last minute. Now, in fact, for those who have access to it in the Eminent Frame, which is a blog of the Social Science Research Council, I published a piece today, which you can find, I hope, in which I make, so I call it Arab and American Revolutions in History. And my point is that rebellions become revolutions in process over time. That no revolution is born a revolution. And no rebellion is sort of precluded from becoming a revolution. Not every rebellion is a revolution, but every rebellion can be a revolution. The question is what we make of it over time. The American Revolution started as a rebellion against the British Crown. And the American colonists who rebelled initially were not as ambitious as maybe we have now painted them to have been. They may have had very limited modest claims, and their claims may have progressed in dynamic ways in the same way that we watch in the Arab region today. That people may start protesting over something and then move on to something else until we need to have more, we need to have everything, and so on, and we transform the nature of the state and the nature of our political organization and so on. So in that piece, I tried to say that the American Revolution, there was nothing exceptional about it. There was nothing inevitable about it. It could have ended as a rebellion, but it has become a revolution over time through what the rebels did, but also what the rest of the world did. And in today's world, what the rest of the world does about Arab rebellions will probably be more significant in influencing the course of events than what happened during the American rebellion come revolution. From that, I move on to say, therefore, the question, of course, the primary role and the fundamental role and the inherently sort of legitimate role is of Arab themselves for themselves. That's the only way to make it a revolution in the fuller sense. But the question is about our responsibility for who we are, where we are. Because regardless of what Arabs manage to do or not to do, whether the rebellions become revolutions or not, regardless of that, we are responsible for what we do or what we fail to do. And it is from this point that I challenge American citizens to confront the reality that their country is probably the only, but by no means the last, I suspect, imperial power in history. At this point, this is the only. The invasion of Afghanistan and of Iraq was the first colonial acts of the 21st century. And this country has been responsible for them. And American citizens have to accept responsibility for that fact, of that reality. And because of the constant intervention and constant military incursions of the United States in the Arab region, and because of particularly the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because of that, American citizens bear more responsibility for what they do or fail to do about Arab rebellions, about democratization in the Arab region, and everywhere else where the United States is implicated, not only as global citizens, but as citizens of the power that is the most interventionist and the most imperialist of our time. Now, finally, to close with another part of my piece about the risk of the Muslim Brothers coming to power, which is an obsession of American media, American intellectuals, American sort of bloggers, everybody talking about that as if, so what? My point is simply, and so what? If you are talking about democracy, you have to accept that possibility. And you have to respect the judgment of the people who are making the choice for themselves. You cannot say that you can be democratic only if you make the choices I wish you to make. It is childish, really. And childish as it is what the major powers have done already in Gaza and now are doing about Egypt too. And the idea that somehow our sort of support of democratization in the region is conditional on the fact that the Muslim brothers are never allowed to come to power. And my claim is that if Muslim brothers, I oppose Muslim Brotherhood, I oppose it all my life. I'm driven out of Sudan because of it, and I'm waiting for it to die so that I can go home. But really, honestly, but the point is still is for me is that I would rather have them out in the open with a stake in the political process, because I know that is transformative of what they can say and what they can do. And that so long as they are excluded, they have a privilege of really never addressing fundamental questions about who they are, what they want to do, and how they intend to do it. So I'm not welcoming it, but if it should happen, I see clear practical advantages for it to happen. But my position is to say that we in this country, every time I use the term we, of course, you ask the question, who is the we here? We in this country, as I happen to be part of it at this point, we in this country owe responsibility for the sins of our own sins, as well as the sins of our state, acting globally, to act in the right way regarding the transformation of Arab rebellions into Arab revolutions. And the American Revolution succeeded over time to give Americans what they now take for granted, for which Arabs are dying on the streets of Benghazi and Trablus and elsewhere. So what do we offer that? That is the level of human rights discourse, I think, that I would claim for myself, I would never cede. And it is political, fundamentally, it is also cultural, it is religious. In every dimension, there is human consciousness and experience. Thank you very much.
So the ground is open for the questions.
You bring up an analogy to the American Revolution, and yet it's fairly clear that the American Revolution would have ended in failure except for the French intervention on behalf of the Americans, and that the intervention of the French in the American Revolution was due principally to their own national self-interest. It didn't have anything to do with their support of American rights in particular. In fact, they were as antagonistic to those kinds of rights as any others. So, I think almost any revolution you look at invites foreign intervention of one kind or another. So when you're saying that Americans have to be responsible for this, and I'm wondering what you actually see the role of America being in this new context.
Okay. I take that you have heard the question, and the point is, it has been 200 years. So are we to repeat? Is the world still the same world that it was 200 years ago for the Arab Revolution to succeed by military intervention by some other power in its self-interest in the same way that the French did for the American Revolution? So my first point is to say that if the American Revolution has succeeded, it should have transformed the United States enough for that not to be necessary and needed 200 years later. And that the need for military intervention or any type of intervention has been sort of exacerbated by the foreign policy of the United States for decades. And that is a difference too. That heightens the responsibility. But the point for me, intervention, I'm not calling for American intervention at all. In fact, I'm totally opposed to any American intervention anywhere. The problem is that, just like with Sharia, I am opposed to people talking about Sharia, but they do. And I'm opposed to American intervention, but Americans keep thinking that they have to intervene, and others keep expecting Americans to intervene. In this reality, I'm trying to say what does that, whatever it is that people want the United States to do, be like. And for me, the notion of imperialism persists, and what I talked about that, by that I mean that we have to build institutional and normative resources that enable us to tame the imperial impulse by advancing and promoting the rule of law in international relations. People keep talking about the United Nations not being effective enough or being too weak and this and that. The United Nations is whatever we make of it. It is not an autonomous entity. And only 4 days ago, the United States used the veto in the Security Council to defeat a resolution condemning Israel for international law and humanitarian law violations with the settlements. And the representative of the United States in the Security Council said that, yes, Israeli policy is inhumane and is contrary to international law, but the Security Council is not the best way to do it. And she said that we cannot use the veto because that will entrench the parties in their position. As if using the veto did not entrench the party in their positions. Because when you use the veto, you entrench Israel in its position in the same way that not using the veto might have entrenched the Palestinians in their position. So you can't have it both ways. You can't talk about neutrality, you can't talk about peace brokering while using the veto to defeat a resolution. The rest of the world, unanimously almost, 120 states, including all the other 4 permanent members of the Security Council, including France and Britain, they all voted for this resolution. So when you do that, you are undermining the possibility of the rule of law, the possibility of credibility of international law, which puts us back to self-help and vigilante justice. So the need for military American intervention is due to acts like that keep undermining and diminishing the credibility and efficacy of international institutions, which would have given us a better alternative than military intervention, American or otherwise.
Thank you for your talk. Could you please elaborate more on how you understand the state? Because based on what you said, it seems as if you assume a universal template of the state that is almost atemporal. Because I don't think that the form, the function, and the fact of the state is universal or the same everywhere. So could you say more about how you're understanding the state?
The state, in my understanding, is a totally historical, contextual entity, that there are no two identical states anywhere, in so-called West or East, South or North. The state is always distinctive to its own society, to its own context, to its own history. That is granted. But as social scientists, as historians, as political, whatever we do in this community, in this audience, there are certain aspects of our tools of analysis, conceptual assumptions, definitions that we use in understanding the state in many parts of the world. What I was decrying or what I was objecting to is the notion of Islamic exceptionalism. What I'm saying is that whatever you do, I'm not exhausting or claiming to know exactly what everybody does about analysis about the state and its nature and so on. Whatever you do anywhere else, do it also for so-called Muslim majority countries. That they are not exceptional. So which I accept, contextual, historical, deeply rooted understanding of the state, absolutely yes. But in the same way that you would, with that understanding, still you would look at the state in Latin America, you would look at the state in Central Asia, look at the state in North America, look at the state in the Middle East, and look at the state in South Asia in the same way. Meaning that you will apply your contextual, historical, specific understanding of the nature of the state for that place, but do it that factor Islam out of your analysis. If you do what we will see, and then bring it in as it just happens to be the religion of people in that place. It is not by virtue of that defining or limiting the nature of the state in that place.
Ayatollah Khomeini, in his famous speech to students in the West, says that many states claim to be Christian and Jewish, but in actuality they're not. They just cloak themselves in the garb of these rhetorics in order to perpetuate their interests to their domestic populations. He then differentiates his idea of the state, Wilayat al-Faqih, as being the rulership of Islamic scholars and thus based on Islam explicitly. What is your response to this with regards to your notion of all states as being necessarily secular?
Iran is secular, has always been secular, including since Khomeini. The problem is that you cannot escape the human. So Wilayat al-Faqih, who is a faqih, is a human being. How does he get to be the ultimate faqih, to have the wilaya, is through politics. So the so-called Islamic Republic of Iran is just as secular as anywhere else, as they said everywhere else. And the fact that in fact, for me, Iran is very instructive because it shows the contradiction of the very idea of an Islamic state.
Is it a secular in conceptualization or a secular in its application for maintenance of state power?
Both. There is no difference. To my mind, there is no difference between that and this and the other. Let me explain. Why, when I said that Iran, the so-called the Islamic Republic of Iran, is very instructive, is because it shows us that we can never escape politics. To say that we have a faqih and who has ultimate authority above the state is, in fact, it is just a constitutional fiction. Because he is part of the political structure and power and struggles. How does he get to be the ultimate faqih? How does he get? Why Khomeini and not anybody else? How did Khomeini get to be where he got to be, to claim that position? I mean, did he descend from heaven? Did he receive revelation that the rest of us are not privy to? He went through that through a political process, and in doing so, he did all what politicians do. He imprisoned and he killed and did all sorts of things that politicians do. So, and in fact, Iran is very instructive in the other way of saying that because of what the United States did in 1953, we ended up with Khomeini in 1979. When the United States staged a coup against Mossadegh, and that is commonly acknowledged fact, that triggered a sequence of events that led to Khomeini coming to power. And now I am saying that if we do not act as Americans in this country in a responsible way, we are precipitating the same type of, when I say imperialism is alive and kicking, it is the same discourse of legitimizing hegemony and intervention, that the Arab can't be trusted to be democratic. So we have to somehow supervise their democracy. In the same way that the British were saying that the Africans cannot be trusted to rule themselves, so we have to. So the white man's burden continues. And that was very much, I think, relevant to what Leila was saying earlier. And the point is that that term, actually, white man burden, I don't know if commonly known, was coined precisely about the United States and its imperial intervention in the Philippines in 1899 to the 1916 and so. So that term was coined for the United States, that the United States has the white man's burden. Kipling was of course ambivalent about how problematic that was, but still he invoked it. But American imperialists at the time embraced the term for themselves to say that yes, we are civilizing the Philippines by colonizing them. So the point is that we understand the nature of these discourses as the same discourses, whether Khomeini is using them or George W. Bush or Obama for that matter.
This advocates spiritual authority from temporal power. Is there any spiritual authority in your opinion, and can it have the temporal hegemony?
The first yes, the second no. That is, there is the possibility of spiritual power, but it's only in the eyes of the beholder. You have religious authority or spiritual authority only to the extent that I grant it to you by choice and can take it back by choice. If there is any limitation to my ability to grant you authority over, because I respect your piety, your knowledge, and I grant you religious authority over me, or spiritual authority as you call it, that's my choice. If I take it back, that is my choice too. Therefore, that's why spiritual authority should not have any temporal influence whatsoever, because it blocks the possibility of its voluntariness, of the autonomy of the believer in making the choice. So therefore, I make a distinction in Islam and the secular state in the book. I make a distinction between religious authority and political authority. Fundamentally, that is, to me, is very critical. So we must be very clear that there are two different types of authority, requiring different types of institutional and personal experience and relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, excuse me for my language, please. I might speak some of Arabic and some of English, but fortunately, Dr. Naim speaking Arabic well. So that will encourage me to do this lecture.
Good.
Yeah. For the, I want to refer to Sharia and human rights. I found your speech as if there is a contradiction. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe we may start with definition to the state. I'm not a professional in political science, but in my very simple understanding that state composition, for example, including constitution, including, for example, economical system, and the public, all the plural will of the population. If we take just these three components and we refer back to Islam, we'll find many concepts rule these three components, for example. The constitution, for example, expressing the will of the population, the will of the majority. Or we can express it in the democracy process that we agreed upon. If it is like this, how can we differentiate that if this public will goes or agreed upon Sharia system, for example? In the economical system, we found also certain rules that rules, economic system and economic concept that should be. Excuse me again for this. I hope that you are understanding me.
I am.
Yeah. If that is so, how can we say that this is absolutely different or separate? And you starting your speech that there is a separate or differentiation between fiqh and Sharia. And me, if I understood it, yes, well, and me, I agree with you in terms of practice. I mean that it's not necessary that all the experiences or practice of Islam is necessary to be expressing the real Islam or all the, the true or actual principles of Islam. So I agree with you, there may be a separation or differentiation between the two, but that is we cannot conclude that in absolute, statement that Sharia and human rights, for example, or Sharia and state system is separate, by the way.
Okay.
On the other side, for me, in human rights, also I know from Islam that, from the position that I'm Muslim, Islam encourage or rule or ordered to keep human rights. However, there may be a violations in the human rights for Muslim societies or communities. But I knew also that Islam ordered us to keep human rights in a universality, by the way, in a universality system, to keep the human rights for our communities, for others, and to accept others, and so and so. So how also, and also Islam distribute the role of to apply this, to apply authority of keeping human rights or advocating human rights and protecting human rights in many levels. For example, state level, community level, family level, and even personal level. All that I found it in Islam. How can we say that Islam and Sharia is not, cannot be together? Really, maybe yes, maybe.
I get your point.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I want just to say that, and excuse me for that. The arrangement of information, or maybe my language is not.
No, it is not that.
Thank you.
Thank you. You made your point very clearly, and let me try to respond. Whenever you say Islam, what you mean is my understanding of Islam. I'm not talking about you personally, but every single person, when they say Islam, what they mean is my understanding of Islam. Because there is no other Islam for you except what you understand it to be. So when you say Islam, therefore what you mean is your understanding of Islam. When I say Islam is my understanding of Islam, there is no universal Islam. There is all Islam of us believers believe it to be, each and single one of us, so as it happens. But you cannot talk about Islam and Sharia as synonymous. Because Islam is, to any other Muslim, is her or his understanding of it, but Sharia is a particular historical trajectory of understanding. So when we say Sharia or fiqh, we are not talking about the totality of Islam, we are talking about a historically conditioned understanding of Islam, historically experienced and practiced. So I say this to say that it is possible to understand Sharia in other ways than what Muslims have done so far. But what Muslims have done so far is totally inconsistent with the idea of human rights. Because human rights are the rights of the human. In Sharia, as historically understood, there is no possibility of rights of the human as human. Rights are by membership, not by humanity. So Muslim men have rights, Muslim women have rights, people of the book have rights, animists may or may not have any rights depending on the school and the view. Therefore, the idea of universal human rights, of the rights of the human as human, is totally incompatible with Sharia as understood by Muslims so far. If one claims that, yes, this is true historically, but I am proposing a different understanding of Sharia, fine, let us listen to that. But we cannot claim that Sharia as currently understood and practiced in Sudan is compatible with human rights. It is not. Because it's not even compatible with civil rights, meaning with the rights of citizens, it is not compatible, let alone with human rights. And of course, there is a difference between human rights and civil rights. Civil rights are the rights of citizens, human rights are the rights of the human. So the point I'm making briefly, so that I don't talk too long about it, but that we should not talk about Islam and Sharia synonymously. When you say Islam, you mean your understanding of it, which is different from many of us in this room who are Muslims. And if you think that I'm not Muslim because I don't agree with your understanding of Islam, that is precisely the problem. But if you think of the variety of Muslim attitudes and positions, let me give you a very concrete example so that we understand the impossibility of enacting Sharia as a state law and calling it Sharia. I'm sure that you are all familiar with the cases of women in northern Nigeria who were sentenced to stoning to death on the charge of zina, that is extramarital sexual relations. Now the point is this, that In northern Nigeria, the Malik school prevails. And the Malik school accepts proof of zina by pregnancy without proof of marriage. So if a woman is found to be pregnant and is known to be not married, circumstantial evidence of that nature can be evidence of proof of zina. And that's why some of those women were convicted of zina, because of the fact that they were pregnant and gave birth to children at the time when they were not married, and therefore they were assumed to be so on. So in one Sunni school, pregnancy is possible to be proof of zina. In all other 3 Sunni schools, pregnancy is not proof of zina. In fact, if you charge a woman of zina out of the fact of her pregnancy, you are committing the other crime of ghasf, which is unproven accusation of zina. So which is Sharia? Is the Malik school Sharia, or are the other 3 Sunni schools Sharia? And does one or the other become Sharia by virtue of being the view of the majority or the dominant view? Because that's exactly how people make up their mind about what is the position on this issue. The dominant view within the Malik school is this, the dominant view in the Hanafi school is that. There is so much variation and diversity of opinions, because there are always opinions and nothing more than that. So in that light, I'm saying that it's a very dangerous proposition to talk about Sharia. It is not. Sharia is not consistent with human rights. Simply because women do not have the same rights as men. And Muslims do not have the same rights as non-Muslims. Animists do not have personhood. They are incapable of having rights because they are polytheists. They are believed to be polytheists, which was not a category that Muslim scholars sort of included in their scheme. So the historical understanding as it exists, we should not pretend that it is anything else. For me, that's why instead of engaging, as I do engage in trying to struggle about how we can have a different understanding of Sharia, I'm saying that let us put all of this aside, because it is really not productive. Because whatever the state does is not going to be Sharia anyway. So why worry about the state enforcing Sharia? Because whatever it does, it is not Sharia. But still, I have to struggle with the fact that Sharia is in the minds of people like you and myself and everybody else who have internalized these values. That's where the real struggle is, not with the state, I think.
Professor, I just want to go back to what you were saying earlier about de-divinizing and demarcating a secular space for the Sharia in modernity. Your model seems quite akin to the British colonial model of how they dealt with the Sharia and religion in general, in that the secular authorization of the space of the religious, the space of what is to be counted as the Sharia. And I'm wondering what kind of an assumption of that sovereign moment in which you translate something as belonging to the sphere of the secular versus the religious. Isn't there also a particular logic of democratic sovereignty that goes into your demarcation of the sphere of the secular, which is being authorized in that moment? So is there not a new divinity of history, of secular history, being replaced by the process of de-divinization that you're taking part in? And how does that open up any new horizon of the political if you're simply replacing one divine with another one of historicization?
Okay.
Or to put it very briefly, how does historicization open any new horizon of the political?
Let me try to respond as I understood your question. I'm not saying that the secular authorized the space for the religious. I'm not saying that. Is that part of the assumption of your question? I'm not saying that the secular authorized the religious. I'm saying that anything to do with the state is secular. But I'm not installing that secular state as the guardian or the protector or the promoter of the religious space. In fact, the exact opposite. To me, making the state, as you call it, de-divinizing or sort of demystify, the term I always find difficult saying it, meaning that to say that the state cannot be divine, cannot be religious, is precisely to empower the religious on its own terms, regardless of what the state does or fails to do. So I'm not in any way invoking the state as the authorizer or the creator or the protector of the space of the religious. And in fact, I'm saying that the state should be kept to its very limited but very marginal position of an institution that has certain powers and authorities, and we have to live with it because of the nature of the functions that it performs. But the real space for life as believers is outside the state, irrespective of the state, beyond the state. I don't see how that is similar to the British colonial model for India or anywhere else. I'm not saying that the state has anything to do with religion. In fact, the exact opposite. I'm saying that the state has nothing to do with my being Muslim or not. The only capacity in which the state can deal with me is as a citizen, not as a Muslim. It has no authority, power, understanding, comprehension, no ability. Who is the state anyway? It's an inanimate political institution. It is not an entity that has a conscience and can make up its mind. It's people who do, and people who control the state. So, but the point is that, in fact, the reason I'm critical about Americans or Europeans thinking of Muslims as communities, almost I call it the new millet system, that we have to be organized as a Muslim community so that they can deal with us as a Muslim community. This is really a negation of the very idea of citizenship and the very idea of the European state itself, which has been sort of transplanted everywhere else. I thought I didn't.
You're making a point about that the human rights don't exist in Sudan or don't exist in Islam, partially because there's not an equivalence of human rights for the animists, for Christians, for women, for example. But human rights has never been deployed that way. I mean, the nature of human rights is always about citizenship in a particular juridical system or political system, right? Is that it always has granted humanity to a person that inhabits that particular legal system. So in that sense, I think the sort of development of an Islamic concept of human rights very much conforms to the history of human rights in general, that the legitimization of the human being comes only through belonging in this particular legal system. Now, if this is the case with the Shari'a, then it's sort of enacting that role of humanizing the Muslim subject, right? And just one other point, because this is something that's come up again and again, and I've been confused about in your argument, both in your writings and in your prior lecture at law school, where you're saying that Sharia is man-made. Okay. Now I see what you're saying. You're saying Sharia as an evolved system of human laws. Okay, and of course everyone's going to agree with that. And yet, then why can't it be at the service of the man-made state? Okay, that seems to be the central contradiction in your argument. And then sort of question, this is much bigger about sort of, I guess, the nature of faith and religion in general, then so where does the divine reside? I mean, if it's not infused in some place in laws that, in just laws.
Okay. The divine rewrite, I'm quoting a hadith. ما وسعني أرضي ولا سمائي وإنما وسعني قلب عبدي المؤمن. God is saying in that hadith, I'm not contained in space or time, but I am contained in the heart of the believer. That's where the divine is. The divine is in the heart of the believer. But coming to the first point, the idea of human rights is a radical project, an extremely recent project, and a project that seeks exactly to transcend the idea of rights by membership. So civil rights are rights of citizens. Human rights are the rights of the human. So it is not true to say that the human rights have always been about rights of citizens or of members of communities and this and that. No, the idea, the concept is the rights of human beings by virtue of being human, without any membership of anything else. I don't have to be anything else other than human to be entitled to human rights. So the idea, you can say it is radical, you can say it is utopian, you can say it is totally unrealistic, but this is what the concept means. And as such, it is not about membership or citizenship. It's about except citizenship or membership of the human race. And therefore, no state whatsoever today has lived up to this value. No state has upheld the human rights of human beings as human beings. And we still fall back constantly to the civic or to the civil rights mode. And Americans actually, I find notoriously confusing civil and political rights, sort of civil rights and human rights. There are places that are called Center for Civil and Human Rights. Civil rights make overlap normatively. That is, the content of the rights may be similar, but the membership or the entitlement to the rights is different. So that idea is radical. And in that sense, Sharia, as understood historically by Muslims, is incapable of giving rights to humans as humans. Because exactly as you put it, it is rights of membership. If you are a Muslim woman, you are a member of this group, you are entitled to these rights. If you are an animist, you are not a member of any group, you have no rights. But if I talk about Sharia as understood historically, the possibilities of transforming our understanding of Sharia is fine, let us do that, but let's acknowledge the nature of Sharia as we have it before we can try to have something else. Now, when you say that if Sharia is man-made, what is wrong with it being put in the service of man-made state? Fine, but don't call it Sharia. Because the object of calling Sharia is precisely to make it divine and to invoke its divinity to protect it from being criticized. So just call it law of the state. And any state, the people of the state, if it's a democratic state, can do whatever law they want to do, fine. That's their choice. And the question is, but calling it Sharia is precisely invoking a notion of divinity that is to insulate law from politics. To say that law is always a product of politics, but to say that when it is Sharia, then it is not human politics, it is divine command. That's what I need to deny. So if the state wants to make Sharia its law, let it do so, but don't call it Sharia, because by calling it Sharia, you are invoking a quality that negates its nature as law. It becomes divine command.
If the origins of human rights are in the rights of man that granted rights to property-owning white aristocratic males, then why would we expect human rights to be any different now when it doesn't grant rights to immigrants and refugees?
Because the American Declaration of Independence was not a human rights document, by the way.
I agree. But there are
Okay,
human rights documents.
until 1945. That is, the French Declaration of the Man and Citizen was not a human rights document. The American Declaration of Independence was not a human rights document. They were civil rights documents. They were rights of citizens, not of humans. The possibility of human rights was not there until the United Nations and decolonization. And the possibility of having a mechanism whereby we can have global understanding that is shared about the rights of the human as human. But all of those antecedents are civil rights documents, but we tend to confuse them with human rights, but they are not human rights documents. Now, the idea of human rights is radical and new. Why should they have, how can human rights bring us something new? How come that the American Declaration of Independence gave us something new too? So when the American Declaration of Independence came, the idea of the Republican sovereignty of the people, even federalism, were totally unknown in human history. How come that it gave us that? Not us, gave the Americans at the time. So the point is that in human history you have creative foundational ideas and documents that take us further forward in terms of our understanding of the nature of our human institutions and how to manage our politics and share resources and allocate all of that. So these are progressions, but the point is that the fact that the human rights idea was totally unknown before 1945, really, doesn't mean that it cannot be known going forward. And it did not become known in 1945 or even 1948 when the Universal Declaration was adopted. But that was a vision. That vision is now more true than it was 60 years ago. And we are still working at it. But the point is that the possibility of human rights as a radical departure is there. It can succeed or fail, but it is not incoherent and it is not impossible to achieve. And for my part, I will stay with it.
Thank you. Just responding to the confusion that I sometimes feel during this discussion, which went through my mind also, a comment that actually I thought of was, there are two basic confusions right now even here. As you said, civil rights and human rights. Conceptually, human rights is for all humans. But the basic document that actually enables us to either verify or call it a violation, the main problem is the violation of human rights, not human rights itself. And nowadays, the whole global issue of human rights is according to that basic premise of the Convention of Human Rights of United Nations. That is the main core of the issue. That this very basic convention is also signed, and the signatories are nation states. So actually, the confusion is that this basic human rights declaration is also dependent on you being a member of some kind of state, because they are the signatories. And they are the ones who have actually ratified it. So when a state ratifies it, a member of a state will be falling under the convention itself. And all those who are not, like refugees, like illegals, and they will not have any such rights. And similarly, tribals and all that. That is why the reason of this confusion throughout the world, and especially in America, as you said, people usually do not make the difference between civil rights and human rights, is because the basic premise is the UN's convention. That by itself, as a core, creates the confusion. And number two is the confusion when you say secular states also, they claim to have Sharia as their law. I'll give an example of Pakistan, for example, calling it Shari'i Qawaneen. They don't call it Sharia. They call it Shari'i Qawaneen, meaning the laws based on Sharia. Hence, the issue is that these states are made of people. People get influenced. It can be divine, it can be fiqh, or it can be anything. I, as a person, happily democratically elected in a parliament, in a democratic assembly, may be totally influenced by that. And hence, I make a law calling it the law of flogging a woman. So hence, I mean, that's where the confusion points are when we don't clear our minds towards the mechanism of working.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. On starting on the second point, I didn't say that, Ellen said. And I said, in fact, I said exactly what you said. I said that if the state, for example, take riba, interest, taking or charging interest. It is a Sharia principle. For me as a Muslim, I'm not allowed to take interest or to charge interest. And I can make that the law of the state. But for me, you can prohibit riba. In this country, they prohibited alcohol. So that was the Sharia principle. So the United States in the 1920s was a Sharia state because they prohibited alcohol. But so long as you are clear that this is a state law that you can change. So the United States amended the Constitution to prohibit alcohol and amended the Constitution again to allow alcohol. When you do Sharia, you can't do that. Once you say you call it Sharia, you can't unmake it. And that's exactly why we have to keep Sharia out of it. So Pakistan, let it have flogging law for women, whatever they want. But the point, don't call it Sharia. Not even Qanuni Sharia, what you call it. Don't mention the term Sharia completely. Now still, the point for me is that I need people, and the point was to my sister from Sudan earlier on also, if you want to enact Sharia democratically, can you unenact it? That is a problem. You can enact it, but you cannot unenact it. And that's why it is not a democratic process. Call it law, enact it as law, change it as law, and that is fine. I think the second point about the state and human rights. I think I did try to make, in fact, I started by saying that the paradox of sovereignty and the paradox of self-regulation by the state, it is paradoxical to expect human rights to be protected by the state. But it's a paradox that we have to work with, to mediate, to practice, because of the nature of the international system. But I did conclude and try to highlight later in my remarks to say that there is much more to human rights than what states do. And that's why in terms of my title about Sharia, I said Sharia is irrelevant for what the state does. Therefore, the human rights issues about the state doing something in the name of Sharia should be easy to deal with by just telling the state, no, you are lying, it's not Sharia. It can't be Sharia. And we can deal with it at that level. I said what is more problematic is the relevance of Sharia to human consciousness and to social institutions, the internalization of Sharia values. That's where the real struggle is. So for me, they are both human rights struggles. But one, as a lawyer, I can see in terms of international institutions, but the other, as a human rights activist in social transformation projects, it is much more what the state can do or fail to do.
Hello.
Hello.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I've been struggling to keep quiet during this, but I have been in agreement with what you have been saying because I was born and raised here in the United States of America, and I have been on the side of not being a Muslim and becoming a Muslim. And I've always told my children, you take who you are wherever you go, to work, to a friend's house, to a neighbor. I can believe what I believe, and it's up to me when I read my Quran to practice my beliefs. Now, I can come to work, and there's a place called institutional equities, being fair with people, making sure everybody's treated fairly. Those are put into place so that everybody can be treated in a way that our society say that we're supposed to be treated. I go on the street and a person can walk up to me and say, why do you wear that? You're in America. You have a right to not wear that, but I have a right to wear it as well. And it's my choice as a Muslim, but in a society where if you enact or don't enact rules of say that they say you're not allowed to wear that. This is the state law. You cannot wear that in this state. That's violating my rights in a way of my religious practice. So I understand why you say you cannot make something Sharia. My religion is separated from what my state enacts. But if it's a law in that state, I can choose to stay in that state or not to follow those rules. And in Sharia, there are different schools. And according to what I feel or believe inside me, I'm going to pick and choose which school of thought that agrees mostly with what I feel and think, and that's in my best interest as a human being. So I do understand those things that are going on. Do you think that what's going on in these foreign countries of rebellion, at any point that the people that do take charge, and my most concern is with Egypt because I have family that's in Egypt. If these groups take control over the state and the U.S. intervene or try to intervene, do you think that it's, well, I believe I know that answer. You said you think that the United States should not intervene with these situations. But we as the United States, just like you say, we feel like we have to. And I just want to understand why we feel that we have to.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm grateful for your endorsement, at least to the extent I understand it. And I think the point is that also the question of the nature of the secular state. Not every state is secular in the sense that it cannot be religious, but not every state is secular enough. That what makes the state secular in the sense that I mean, which is a neutral state regarding religious doctrine, that's what I define the secular state to be. So initially I'm denying a religious quality of the state. But then I have to struggle to make the state as secular as I need it to be, meaning exactly as you say, so that it has nothing to do with the way I dress or and sort of my life and my choices I make and so on. That is sort of, that goes back to the question earlier about the nature of the state being historical and contextual. Now this country is secular significantly in that respect. But obviously there is more to be done. Some European states are not as secular in the same way. And we see that in the news sometimes. But the point is that, yes, we do have this blessing, I would say. And I think when I say that, I can be Muslim in the United States more than I can be Muslim in any Muslim majority country. And in fact, I was tempted at some point, I'm writing a book about American Muslims, and I was tempted to call it the Islamic Republic of the United States. Meaning that it is the possibility, and I know time is up. Okay, let me be very brief. Coming to your point, the question is that we cannot protect Egyptians from making mistakes for themselves. In Sudan, we have made sort of disastrous mistakes, and we are paying for them. And that's precisely what democracy is about. People make mistakes and learn from their mistakes. There is no possibility of protecting your children from making mistakes for themselves. So if they make that mistake, let them live with it. They will have to pay more for it than what we have to pay for it. But there are things in which we can do without being interventionist. I mean, just cut off your supply of arms and the protection that you give to these regimes. It is not sending your Marines. Just simply stop your money. That can make a difference in terms of political democratization in the region. And stop your drones too. I mean, the problem is that you're sending your drones to Pakistan or into Yemen is part of what is legitimizing a more radicalized elements of Islamic politics. Thank you very much. I think my chair was saying.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.